All right, let's get right into it while we're waiting for people. But first of all, I'm going to share my screen so you guys can see this. Uh, should be here. Okay, cool. You guys can see this?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So these are going to be the steps for using identity frames. Does everyone here know what an identity frame is now?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
No.
Ricky, give me some context. What is an identity frame?
So it's pretty much finding out the prospect on what is it that they're gonna play into, right? So let's say they wanna just say, how do I do this, or why do I do this, or where would that take me? And then you want to frame it for their fitting, if that makes sense.
Well, yes. So
Mm.
it's changing the prospect's identity, right? What I mean by that is like start by identity. Like you have to identify their traits of who they are. Are they an A type? Are they someone who's very confident? Are they someone who, for example, like believes that they're the best? How do we change their way of thinking into someone who wants to improve? And how do I identity frame them to be a person who wants to improve? You see, it's changing their way of thinking. So then you get them start acting like the person who you want them to be. You see?
Mm.
So you're
Yeah.
changing their actions throughout conversations, which is contrasting with a negative trait, right? So we always have to ask a what question. A what question gets the prospect like really thinking about the consequences for people who have those negative connotations. So for example, if I say to you, Anthony, when I came in, like what typically happens to people who feel like they're the best and like stop really training? What typically happens to those people?
They just don't get better.
You see? So
Yeah.
now we start getting them to feel because if they're like, yeah, I'm the best. Well, what typically happens to people who don't really feel like they need to get better and kind of already like stop doing training? What happens to those people?
All right.
And then you ask a how question next because the how question is going to get them to realize the negative impact of what's going to happen if they keep thinking in that way. You see?
Yeah. All
So
right.
how does that normally affect someone who just doesn't train and keeps doing the same things? I don't know. You see?
Yeah.
Where do people normally end up who think that way? You see? Now we're consequencing their way of thinking because these questions is going to get the prospect to consider the consequences of them thinking in that way and what's going to happen. You see? And then
Yeah.
you ask a why question, which is like really asking an impact question at the end of the day because you want them to internalize the impact of them not doing anything. You see? This is
Yeah.
all
Oh
building
yeah.
in their head, to switching the person who they are and who they need to be. Now, we can use an example here, right? So, let's say someone who new salespeople, right? This is how you identify them to be the person who you want to be straight away. So, I can tell you're someone who's eager to learn and want to improve, which is fantastic, especially when you're just starting out. A lot of salespeople feel like they can figure things out on their own without really even taking advice and end up like really struggling with results. Have you noticed what happens to reps who like typically try to do it on their own? You see? You see now what are we doing there? Does anyone know?
Putting doubt in their way of thinking, showing them that it doesn't work,
Yep. And then
the
how do
consequences.
the next is a how question. How do those people do normally in terms of results? Well, I normally don't get really good results. And where do they usually end up? You see, we're constantly framing these people into thinking the way that we want them to think.
Hmm.
So why is it important for you to not be like one of them? You see? So now we're really shifting their way of thinking and who they need to be. And if you want, you can ask an impact question and a consequence question if you feel like they aren't resonating with it. So what impact would it have if you didn't stay open to learning? And if you kept being the same version of yourself? What do you feel like would be the results of you doing the same things? I don't know. Is that making sense for you?
Hmm.
Okay. Now we really have to set up the frame, right? So again, it comes with there's so many examples and there's so many variations that we can use. So for example, I'm really thankful to be in a conversation with someone who gets it. I really appreciate you being open-minded. You know who people like are really close-minded and like keep giving like surface level answers? This is how you get them to shift their perspective. So, yeah, man, I'm really thankful to be in a conversation with someone who really gets it, man, and like is really open-minded. Because normally, what happens to people who like aren't open-minded, man, and just like don't really want to answer questions, so we can find out the issues to help them. Oh, I don't really get to learn. And what impact does that have on people who don't really ever get to training to be able to get help? So what happens if you don't? You see? And now we're into it. Is everyone understanding identity frames at a high level so far?
Yeah.
So it's very important to really understand these frames. Now, again, we go new salespeople, the salespeople with high egos with poor performance. How many times do we get this, guys? Probably a lot of times, right? So this is a frame that you guys need to use for people who have a high ego but have a very low performance. So we can be like, hey man, I can tell you're someone who's confident, but also recognizes that there's always room for improvement. So I really appreciate to talking to someone as intelligent and as humble as you. You see, you're lowering their ego. You'd be surprised how many salespeople are confident but don't really work on what's really holding them back. You know what I'm saying by that? Have you noticed what happens to salespeople who rely on confidence but don't actually ever focus on improving their skill set? What normally happens to them? Where do you end up? Where do they normally end up? You see? And now we're getting them to rewire their way of thinking to not be that person, to not be the person with the high ego. And they're going to be a lot more humble. You see? Stubborn salespeople. So people who like want to do one thing and like are very, like, let's say, for example, they just don't want to change. People who are like thinking that their way is the best or the leads are the issue, right? So you just use this frame. Hey man, you seem like a type of person who's really willing to adapt and based on like what actually works. I'm really thankful to be in a conversation with someone like that because you wouldn't realize the amount of salespeople who aren't willing to adapt and who aren't willing to change. Like, how do those people normally perform? What normally happens to those people? Why is it important for you not to be like one of them? What happens if you do become one of them? You see?
Mm.
And again, it's just constantly reframing their mindset to be someone who we need them to be. So identity frames is a short way of literally rewiring someone's mindset. You guys have to do that at a very high level. This is super important because in calls, you're going to have different personalities and you're going to need to be able to rewire that personality's brain. Because if they come on with a high ego and they're not willing to change, how are we ever going to help them change? So we have to just use an identity frame to get them to start thinking like the person who we want to be, which is someone humble who's willing to change. And we use it through these 4 steps: the how, the what, and the why questions. Make sense?
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah.
Now, what I want to do, I'm going to get you guys to practice these frames and use this. So Philip, I want you to role play with Anthony, and then you guys are going to you're going to use an identity frame for a high ego salesperson or a high ego person in fitness, someone who doesn't feel like they need help, right? Because you're doing fitness.
Okay, so how should we start? Like,
Yeah.
Okay, so for example,
Good stuff.
you just want to ask first of all, your question, which is your positive. Hey man, I really appreciate being with someone on the call like you because of XYZ, and then you start going into it. You see?
yeah, man, I really appreciate, being on a call with somebody who really knows what they want, but what typically happens to those people who, think that they know everything, and are not willing to change or open to any new ideas?
I feel like I guess stay the same. We can't really get better.
And how do you think that, I don't fucking know, like, so it said what, how, and what?
What, how, and why, right? What, how, and why. Or how, where do they typically end up, and then why? You see? So it's super important. So let me show you how I would have framed it. Like
Mm,
the one thing you miss is like a negative contrast because you don't realize the amount of salespeople. Like you don't realize, man, like the amount of salespeople or the amount of people who come into my call and like are stuck in their ways and don't really ever change their ways, which causes them to like never get to the body who they want to be, the body that they want to be at truly. Because what actually happens if you see and then you go into your what question? So you got to do a positive contrast. Hey man, I really appreciate you being on the call because you're XYZ guy. Because I get on a lot of calls with people who are like XYZ, the person who they are right now and who you want them to change. Because what typically happens to people who are like that? You see?
mm,
So the way I would do it is be like, hey man, you really seem like the person who's willing to adapt and adjust based on like what really works. I'm really thankful to be in a conversation with someone like you, man. Because you wouldn't realize the amount of people who like think they already are what they would need to be or don't really ever feel like they need coaching. And they just keep doing the same thing even though it's not working. Because what actually happens to people who refuse to look at a different perspective and refuse to get help? What normally happens to those people?
I
Where do
don't
they,
get that.
where do they typically end up at?
Mm,
Why is it important for you to be adaptable and be able to change though? But what happens if you don't? If you like, what happens to people who aren't adaptable and who don't change and keep acting in that way? What happens to those people? You see? So now we're using
mm.
that frame and then we're rewiring their mindset. So I want you just to role play that.
Yeah, Anthony. So I really appreciate being on a call with somebody who really knows what he wants, and like because there are a lot of people who know like exactly what they want to do and where they want to go. But what typically happens to those people who don't seek help and think that they know everything? What typically happens to those kind of people?
They just don't really go anywhere. Like they just stop growing, I guess.
Yeah, and where do you think that would lead you if you wouldn't like take any action and when you wouldn't be able to any new ideas?
No, where do people typically end up who have that XYZ mindset? You see, the reason you do that, man, is because you're getting them to think what happens if they think like that mindset. You can't target them. You're indirectly targeting them, though. Does that make sense?
Mm,
You're
okay.
indirectly targeting them. They can't feel like they're being attacked at all in this sequence.
Basically, pointing a mirror.
Exactly, pointing a mirror, but not really telling them that you're pointing it at them. But they're
Hmm.
in the back of their head, what are they thinking psychologically? Oh shit, this is me. Oh shit, what
Yeah.
if I keep acting like that person?
Mm,
Oh shit, what if
okay.
I keep being stuck in my tracks? You see? Make sense?
Okay.
Cool. Whatever.
Gotcha.
Let's do this. Why don't I screen share? Practice saying this, and I'm gonna do it one more time without the screen share, right? So obviously adapt it to your industry and the way you want it. But which people do you normally struggle with the most? What type of person?
The ones who are like vague,
Vague.
like yeah, just or don't want to open up type shit. That's what I say.
Okay. Stubborn. Stubborn's gonna be the way. Procrastinators. You have fearful prospects. We have stubborn salespeople. Let's go with stubborn salespeople, okay? Or that's stubborn people in your industry.
You seem like a type of person who's
You
willing
can
to
adjust this
adapt.
to what you feel like would sound natural for you. Like you seem like the type of person who's really willing to adjustment based on what works. So you can really adjust this fitness. And you really seem like the person who really likes change and doesn't really like to be the person who doesn't wait for a coach, man, and kind of does things on his own. Because what typically happens to people who just try to do things on their own? You see? And you want to use negative contrast, which is going to be super important. Because you know all those people who like try to go to the gym by themselves and like always use the wrong form and aren't really open about their situation. What only happens to those people? You see?
They don't go anywhere. Yeah.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Whenever you're ready, you can shoot it.
Yeah, man, you seem like the type of person who like willing to who's open to new ideas, and because I'm really thankful to be with somebody like you who is open to new ideas. But because you wouldn't realize that a lot of people that get into these calls, that they think that they know everything, and because they've been going to the gym for so long, what do you think like typically happens to them?
Well, I feel like you just don't will get better, in the gym.
Yeah, and how do those type of people usually perform? When it keeps like when it comes to going to the gym for years.
Well, I feel like they perform pretty bad, I guess.
Yeah, and where do like those type of people usually end up?
Well, they end up not getting to the desired result. They don't end up being the person that they want to become or the person that they want to become when they see themselves in the mirror.
Yeah, man, and why it's so important for you to be open to new ideas and to understand how you should do I don't know new diet or something like that.
Well, obviously, I should be open because, like I'm not going to get there based on what I've tried in the past. So if you obviously know something that I don't, so why not be
Yeah,
open to that?
Okay.
and
See, way better, right?
yeah,
See that?
yeah.
So you're getting
I
better.
just like needed to get it into my fucking head, like the
Yeah.
structure, because I know, yeah, okay, what,
Yeah.
how, where, why,
It
it's
all
easy,
goes
but I
back
have,
down to the fundamentals again. It's all going to be the fundamentals when we understand this. This is what we have to understand at a high level. Alexa, just I know you're joining in. We're talking about identity frames, how to identity frame the person to being the person who you want to be. Okay. So this is what we're talking about. And I made a whole doc on this, right? So with that being said, first of all, it's going to be, as you see here, is start by identifying the prospect with a positive trait and then using a negative trait, right? Then you're asking a what question, a how question, a where question. So then we're going to put this all into examples. Okay. So for example, have you ever seen someone you're selling in the car industry, right? Or the people who want to get into cars. So you want to then go into, let's say, for example, people who are new to it. Do you ever get people who are new, or what's the biggest
Yeah,
prospect type that you struggle with? Do you feel like
usually those
the
because
new
they,
people?
yeah, because they say that they haven't started before because they were new.
Okay, so let's do this, right? So what you say straight away, hey Alexa, I can tell you're someone who's like really eager to learn and improve, which is fantastic, especially when you're starting out, because a lot of new people who are starting in XYZ industry feel like they can figure things out on their own and normally just do it themselves and really like struggle with getting results. Have you noticed like what actually happens to people who aren't really open to learn and invest in themselves and just try to do it alone?
No, I don't know. Like I was learning by myself, and also like the leader was teaching me some like sales training. I was
I'm not
wanting
talking I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about what happens to people who normally are willing and open to learn and not willing to invest themselves. What typically happens to those people
that are willing to invest.
that aren't willing to invest and are willing
Ah,
to be able to learn? What typically happens to those people?
they get stuck. Yeah, like they're getting this in place.
Okay, and how do their results normally come up, man, when they keep doing things like that?
Um, I don't know, like by results, they stay in the same place.
Right, because where did they usually end up if they just keep trying to do things on their own and like keep failing and then retrying?
Yeah, like the majority just leave the industry.
So what actually happens if you aren't open to learn? You see, and now we start going through that frame. Is that making sense to you? How we've just
Yeah.
switched their mindset. Now they switch from someone who isn't open to learn, who isn't willing to invest themselves, to someone who is now. You see? You see how I just shifted your identity within that frame? So it's something that you really need to learn, right? It's like I can tell you're someone. So the way you're starting the conversation, like, look, I can tell you're someone who's really eager to learn and improve, which is fantastic, especially when you're just starting out. Because we all know new people in your industry who feel like they can figure things out on their own, but end up struggling and getting bad results. Have you noticed like what actually typically happens to those people? Where do they normally end up? You see, so they're getting to realize what happens to people who have the mindset that they currently have. Is that making sense?
Mm.
Yeah, and for example, when I try to do that, like they always tell me like they have been learning with the dealer, with the training, and they have been like first they wanted to learn sales.